Welcome, everyone. My name is Jessica Reese, and I am with Green Penny Bank, and I'm excited to be here. This is our fourth Renew Wisconsin conference, and what a great event. We have seen lots of familiar faces with folks that we've met over the past few years, but we also have met a lot of new people today, so it's been a great day already, and we're just getting started. For those who don't know, Green Penny is a bank, like I mentioned, and the thing that's different about Green Penny is we make the pledge to our customers that we will only use their deposits to finance renewable energy or carbon-reducing projects. So we specialize in solar lending, and we've done a lot here in the state. We've financed about 1,700 projects across the Midwest over the last 3 years. 440 of those have been in Wisconsin. So we really appreciate doing business here in your state and like it a lot and really care about making sure that this renewable energy transition happens. And one of the ways that folks don't often think about helping the renewable energy transition is to make a deposit. Where you bank does matter. And if you want to help renewable energy happen in Wisconsin, maybe consider opening a Green Penny account, and that in turn would help a family put solar on their roof here in Wisconsin and help us fulfill that mission of financing a sustainable tomorrow. So with that, again, thanks for your attendance and support of this great event. Hats off to the Renew staff. And Michael, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. I can hear myself, so I assume everybody else can as well. If you're wondering what you're doing here, you are attending a panel session titled Accelerating Customer Adoption of Low Carbon Distributed Energy Resources. That's a bit of a mouthful. But anyway, thank you for coming. I'm excited to moderate a panel. We have 3 outstanding speakers, and I think you'll enjoy their perspectives on this question. I'll start simply before I introduce Corey and Maria and Tim. I'll start by noting that session title is a social goal, and it is encoded in federal law, principally through the Inflation Reduction Act. And the IRA, as I'm sure all of you know, provides incentives for such distributed energy resources as solar PV, battery storage, ground source heat pumps, and that's all well and good. But I want to also point out that it is not a regulatory goal at this time. It could be, but it is not at this time. What we are facing right now is simply this. While many Wisconsin residents see distributed energy resources as stepping stones to a lower carbon and more electrified energy future, the regulatory environment is at this point still not quite aligned with this transition. And quite often, installation opportunities either are slowed or, in some cases, just put on the back burner indefinitely. And this is that's what we're here to talk about today, this misalignment. So representing a variety of interests and perspectives, the panelists in this session will discuss the benefits and costs of integrating more distributed energy resources into the utility resource mix for customers and for utilities, and identify the policy tools for delivering the promise of distributed energy resources to the broader customer base. So our 3 panelists are, I will start in the middle, Maria Drews. Maria will be representing, Maria is a co-owner of a renewable energy business. It's specifically Drews Solar, a residential solar installation company based in Madison, serving south central Wisconsin. When not working on the transition to renewable energy, Maria could be found biking her children to preschool, running a small photography business, and learning to skateboard. I wish her well. To Maria's left is Tim Lindell. Tim was born and raised in Wisconsin and went to UW for undergrad before heading west to California to learn how to be a renewable energy attorney, where he practiced for a decade before moving back to Wisconsin 4 years ago. When Tim meets someone new and does not want to spend a lot of time talking to them, he tells them he is a lawyer. If it is someone he wouldn't mind speaking to, He tells them he spends a lot of time representing the rooftop solar industry, largely fighting the utilities to ensure customers have the ability to put solar panels on their roofs. If it's someone he really wants to impress, he tells them that he once represented Renew Wisconsin in a net metering case and was able to work with Andrew Kell in the audience and myself as witnesses.
Just kissing your butt.
Yeah. At this point, the person, Tim notes that at this point, the person usually asks for a selfie.
It occurs to me, Michael, that I forgot to send you a fun fact if you had asked for one. Proceed.
Why, it's Corey Singletary to my left. Corey is the Director of Regulatory Affairs for the Citizens Utility Board of Wisconsin, also known as CUB. This independent nonprofit organization serves as a consumer advocate for Wisconsin's residential and small business public utility customers. Corey is an expert in utility cost allocation and rate design, having testified in over 80 cases before the Public Service Commission of Wisconsin. Prior to joining CUB in 2017, Corey was employed by the Public Service Commission as an energy policy advisor and utility rate analyst. A UW-Milwaukee graduate, Corey holds a BS in biology and a BA in international studies. He also holds a master's degree in international public affairs and a graduate certificate in energy analysis and policy from UW-Madison. All right, so we have maybe 40 minutes at this point, so let's dive in. Let's dive in. So I am just going to offer two very broad points, and then I'm going to turn it over to Corey, Maria, and Tim for basically their opening statements. So I'm just going to offer this sort of high-level perspective, which is that it's clear, it's basically undisputable that distributed energy resources deliver savings to customers. But to the utilities, it's a bit more of a double-edged sword. When these resources reduce the need to invest in new generation or other infrastructure, the utilities lose out on the profit that's baked into capital outlays. Yes, they can save money, reduce their revenue requirement, but the profit-making potential is diminished. So what does that mean? It means that this clearly calls for some kind of balancing act performed by the regulator to make sure that that both sides can, as to the greatest extent possible, achieve their objectives without diminishing, for example, the social goals or the private goals of both the customers and the utilities. Now, technology often evolves at a much faster pace than utility regulation. The regulation adopted in the 1970s and 80s did not anticipate the emergence of behind-the-meter solar, for example, as a customer resource. The central grid of yesteryear is starting to give way to a more decentralized and interactive structure in which customers have more options to manage their energy use. But we still have a centralized grid at this point, and the regulation we have today reflects that. So as a consequence, the Regulatory Balancing Act has become a much more complicated affair, prompting a rethinking of rate design, incentive policy for both customers and utilities, and to look at the relationship between price signals and carbon reduction. So with that, I'm going to turn it over first to Corey and Maria, then Tim for opening statements.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I think one of the things you highlighted in terms of not only in utility regulation and where distributed energy resources sort of interface with the law, is about balance. You'd mentioned the balance between customers and utilities. As Michael mentioned, CUB is the consumer advocate for all residential and small business customers. So that means we work on behalf of customers that are very interested in investing in distributed energy resources, in a clean energy future, and everyone, and also customers who aren't. And so we also have to balance internally not only sort of the public interest and the making certain that there's a healthy utility to provide utility service, but also, sort of competing interests even within, say, the residential space. And, when we're thinking about a lot of the things you'd mentioned in terms of rate design and policy, internally, we try to keep it simple. And if you actually go and visit Rich Stork over at our table, there's actually a little tent there with 3 rate design principles that were sort of simplified and articulated by the Regulatory Assistance Project, which I'm going to butcher now. But is essentially, a customer should be able to obtain utility service to connect to the grid for no more than the cost of connecting to the utility system. That customers should pay for the service they receive, basically proportional to how much they use it, and according to the cost to provide that service. And customers who provide electricity to the grid should be compensated, should receive the value of that to the system, which sounds really simple and great, and we can all go home. But at the end of the day, the devil's in the details. And when Michael asked me to be on this panel, I immediately thought, well, I'm going to be the least popular guy in the group. But reflecting back on it in Cub's history more recently, most of the time we tend to be generally allied with folks that are looking to accelerate into a clean energy future, accelerate adoption of distributed energy resources by the end-use customer, but maybe not necessarily all the way to the extent that the advocates in the space are wanting, because we think that historically, to Michael's point, that the value of those resources has been understated, and that there's a little bit of a thumb on the scale before the regulator as to how the evidence in favor of or against these types of investments or programs for customers has been presented. So for us, it's a complicated balance. We try to do the best that we can at the end of the day, but for us, we want to make certain that customers have options, that they have choices, and that essentially that the rules aren't rigged in a way that where they can't do what they need to do if it's a reasonable pathway for customers.
Thank you.
So I'm Maria Drews, and I run a residential rooftop solar installation company. So in kind of this balancing of the need for distributed energy resources and the utilities, I have this kind of focus on this small niche within this great world, which is simply rooftop residential solar panels. And we're based here in Madison, Wisconsin. We serve Dane County and the surrounding counties. And what I would say from the customer perspective, from the people that I work with, is when choosing to invest in solar for their own home or not, they're kind of looking for 3 things. They're looking for some sort of economic benefit, they're looking for predictability in their billing, and the vast majority of our customers are looking for some sense of doing some economic good. And so balancing the needs of the utilities and homeowners looking to go solar, those are the 3 biggest things that I think need to be kept in mind on behalf of the homeowners. If the rules change and the economic benefits, the economic savings are no longer there, or they're largely diminished, if bills become very unpredictable after going solar based on the rate structures and rules that the utilities put in place, or if homeowners get the sense that their utility is going to be working against them, possibly changing the rules down the road, putting up barriers, making it hard for them to go solar and sell that electricity back to the grid, they're going to feel this sense of I don't know that I want to stick my neck out there and put solar on my home and put a place of opposition with my utility. So we'll touch on these points some more, but I think that's the big 3 from the homeowner perspective in solar.
That's great. Hi, everybody. As Michael said, I'm Tim. Unfortunately for you all, these are going to be my thoughts, Tim's thoughts, not those of my brilliant colleagues or clients, because I kind of disagree with some of those people in some places, so I just want to be extra clear with that up front. I think there's 3 really exciting places with regard to distributed energy resources and technologies that are happening in Wisconsin where things are a little different than they've been for a while. So I just want to introduce those, and I think one we're going to go into in a lot of depth here. The first is the Commission finally acted on third-party financing of distributed energy resources. So that is basically when a customer signs a power purchase agreement or a lease agreement with a solar provider, that solar provider then serves that customer. The customer doesn't have to make an upfront payment on the system, et cetera. They can realize savings immediately. it's a great thing for people like middle to low income customers who may not have the 15, 20, 30 grand that it takes to invest in an upfront solar system. So it can really increase a lot of access to these technologies. The Commission's decision was a pretty significant step forward. We had had inaction on this for about 10 years. And so that inaction was acting as kind of a de facto prohibition, but now we have some progress at least. Of course, the utilities appealed that decision. We're in the middle of that appeal. They've all but argued that society as we know it will fall apart if you sign a lease for your solar panels. And we'll see where that appeal goes, but it was really nice to see the Commission kind of stand up for what I think is a pretty sensible policy. The second place where I think we might see some progress, which is kind of exciting, is I don't know if you all were in the larger session, but that West Cap story. The story about affordable housing, putting solar on the roofs or in those really pretty solar flowers for people that are renting. And everybody's favorite late night reading, Wisconsin PSC code section 113.8.03. It prevents, right now it's preventing a lot of multifamily buildings from putting solar on those houses. Specifically, that law says that each individual customer has to be individually metered, which requires dividing a large solar array into individually metered and wired systems. And that kind of kills the project economics for those big systems. So then the owner of that needs to go seek either a waiver from the Commission or the utility has to agree that the project can move forward. Ironically, the purpose of that rule is to ensure conservation. And the idea was you didn't want a tragedy of the commons where everything's not individually metered, so one person can use way more electricity than someone else and everybody has to pay for it. But that hasn't aged very well because now the rule is preventing clear conservation technologies from moving forward. So the Commission has opened a docket to start to make clearer to developers when those waivers will be adopted or will be approved and when they won't be approved so that developers can start to plan their projects around some clearer standards. The docket is just kicking off, but it's something that I think we might be able to see some real progress on multifamily, on opening access to these resources that other people haven't had. And then the last one is net metering. And the Commission has said it's going to plan to take a more holistic approach to the policy of net metering, but we don't need to address that right now because we're going to get into it in a bit.
Thank you, everyone. All right, so on that point, net metering. Net metering was a high-profile battle in 2023. We had two high-profile cases, rate cases, one involving Madison Gas and Electric and the other Alliant Wisconsin Power and Light. And both utilities sought to re-engineer their net metering service. And so to boil down the value proposition of net metering to the greatest extent possible, we're talking about an energy billing tool that allows you to store the excess energy that flows out to the grid that you don't use, and you are compensated for that exported energy at the retail energy rate by and large. And that's what we have in Wisconsin up to a certain limit. And Madison Gas and Electric and Alliant Energy sought to significantly depart from that particular model. So fortunately, the Public Service Commission denied their proposals, and so the status quo still holds, but we anticipate either more proposals. I will refrain from calling them attacks, but we can expect utilities to continue to press on this point. So I have two related questions for the panelists. First, how should the PSC go about determining whether adjustments to net metering are necessary? And the second one is, should the PSC determine that adjustments to the formula would be necessary, how should they be implemented? In what format or venue? How should the PSC go about doing that? So I will start again with Corey.
Just put the lightning rod right here. Well, so I mean, Your first question is, how should the commission go about determining whether or not a change is necessary? This is my view, not necessarily Cub's view specifically as an organization, but in my opinion, as a rate analyst, so I think down at the spreadsheet level, is as you described, net metering is a billing function. It is, in my view, sort of a leftover of federal energy policy and timing and what was implementable when PURPA sort of enabled net metering decades ago, and putting in place more expensive metering was a prohibitive hurdle to the adoption of small-scale renewables at the time. And so, back in the olden days, you would take your little spinny electromechanical meter and pull out a ratchet so the thing could go backwards, just like trying to crack open an odometer and roll it backwards, right? And so I look at it through the lens of like, okay, well, net metering, as most people conceive of it, it was a function of the technology and where we were at the time, and now it's 2023, and with the acceleration of the technology and the interest in the consumer space of having behind-the-meter technologies that are rooftop solar or other load modifying technologies, I think the time has come. It's clear that we need rates that are better reflective of not only the cost to serve customers, but also the value of those resources to the grid. And my personal opinion is that very traditional net metering, where you are just sort of, basic kilo per kilowatt hour, especially if you're on just a flat rate where you're paying the same rate all the time, does a disservice actually to net metering customers over the long run, because it distorts that price signal, all right? And if this is where I want to make certain that my answer here, and this is a little bit to the second one, is to your second question, is there was the proposals we saw from Madison Gas and Electric and Alliant this year. Cub put in testimony, I put in testimony, that conceptually at a high level, we agreed that we needed to move to a more granular framework for rates. But numbers are important, and how you do that is important. And like I'd mentioned earlier, there is a traditional view that sort of puts the thumb on the scale of how you value the value of rooftop solar to the system. MG&E's proposal looked more like that, right? That very sort of utility-centric view of what the value to the system is. I'm going to make eye contact with the gentleman at the back of the room. Alliance proposal, I testified, we thought was a better, like, clean sheet approach, more of an attempt to have a fair, balanced approach to come up with rates, whether it was what the utility initial came out the gate with, and or what was agreed to later on in the proceeding. And so I wanted to walk through that nuance, because I think we're there. We need to move to something new, because in the long run, it's going to facilitate not only rooftop solar, but storage and other behind-the-meter technologies in a way that net metering doesn't. And then, part of the reason we supported that proposal at Alliant is we thought that would serve as a nice sort of benchmark or floor for the whole state. We would prefer that these types of statewide policy decisions be handled in sort of a statewide arena. Before a commission, it's usually referred to as a generic docket or a statewide investigation. In an ideal world, this is a statewide rate-making policy. We would do it that way, right? And to Tim's point, the commission has expressed an interest in that. So thankfully, we're there, and we're probably still all going to disagree on what the numbers are or should be at the end of the day. But I think framework-wise, that's the right way to go.
I'm going to allow you next.
So, as Corey alluded to, net metering is a policy that goes back really to the late 70s. This is a classic example of regulatory lag. And in the state of Wisconsin, moreover, there's really no organic policy that informs the regulatory perspective at a statewide level. So utilities are free to freelance, if you will, on the design of their net metering programs. Maria.
Yeah, so from the residential solar perspective, 90% of our customers for our business were either MG&E or an Alliant. So when they proposed changes to net metering, that caught my attention very quickly. And I think the three things, we'll start here. Just looking at MG&E, I think about 1.5% of residential customers in the MG&E territory have rooftop solar. So I say that to just be here in the Madison area. We think of it as a progressive, forward-looking community, and we just have 1.5% or somewhere about there of residential rooftop solar here. So I think solar in Wisconsin is still, in many ways, at the very beginning of its stages of life here. And so as a residential installer, I think we still have a lot of work to do in our area and in our state. So when it comes to looking at alternatives to net metering, whether or not it's time to make those changes, I'm gonna push that to Tim to answer. But when it comes to what it looks like, I think a few things. One, back to my points at the beginning, the changes, whatever comes after net metering, needs to preserve the economics of going solar, at least in some ways, and the predictability. I think most customers right now that we work with have a return on investment of the rooftop solar arrays of 9 to 13 years. I think that's rather kind of the standard in this area in south central Wisconsin. But some of these proposals are pushing out those timelines to 15, 16, 17 years. And I don't think that there's an appetite for going solar and investing $20,000, $25,000, $30,000 for a system that's going to take 16 years to pay for itself. Most homeowners can imagine where they're going to be in life in 10 years, but not in 17 years. And all of a sudden, putting that much money into rooftop solar array, the reasons to do it go way down. Same with really unpredictable bills. In the alternatives to net metering, if your bills are going to be all over the place, if you have to pay for your rooftop solar array with perhaps taking out a loan for your lower or moderate income household, having wildly unpredictable bills, there's just no appetite for that. So I think the alternatives to net metering need to keep those things in mind. I also think the alternatives to net metering need to happen over time. As Corey alluded to, some of the alternatives that MG&E and Alliant proposed would make batteries more economic, make more economic sense for homeowners. Right now, a single battery system installed with the electrical work to put it in your home, minimum $10,000 for a single battery, maybe up to like $15,000 depending on what's needed. And most households would need two to have the kind of battery systems. So I think the community and also installers like us would need time to make the transition into making batteries kind of a typical part of a solar array. The education, and for companies like ours, just even the time to train ourselves and our staff to install battery systems. We do not at this time because net metering kind of serves as customers' batteries. There's no economic incentive with net metering to put in batteries. So that transition would need time. My final thought on whatever comes next is really wanting the modeling and the and the math to be there. I think in some of the work done this past year and looking to alternatives to net metering, still at the end of the day, there were different numbers, different timelines, and there's so many factors into what these alternative plans could look like that it's going to take some time, in my opinion, hopefully third-party groups to come in and really verify those numbers to look at what is the best alternative that is going to continue to promote residential solar in Wisconsin, at the same time meet the needs of utilities.
So I have a lot of thoughts on net metering. I've been working on this issue for 15 years in a number of different places, and it's really controversial, right? Like net metering is to energy policy what abortion and immigration issues are to national politics. Like nothing gets people more fired up in our weird little corner of the world than a good old-fashioned net metering battle. And that's what I've been doing for the last decade. So I think there's a few things we can recognize. First, we have some time in Wisconsin. To Maria's point, you look at percentage of customer accounts, and I'm relying on Mr. Kell's testimony from this past case, 17.6% of customer accounts in the state of Hawaii have solar. If you look at just residential, it's in the 30s. Like if you've flown into Honolulu recently, it looks like every house has solar on it. From my perspective, it's like one of the coolest places to go visit. California, 8.7%. Statewide average in Wisconsin is 0.3%. MGE's service territory was 1% in 2021. Alliance was 0.5%. So we have some time. We can be deliberative. We can be intelligent about where we're going to go here. We can provide a long runway to the solar industry that says, this is our endpoint. These are the steps we're going to take to get there. You can plan your business around where we're going to go. And I think that benefits everybody. The second thing is you have to look at the cause of this entire fight. And that cause, in my opinion, is mostly tied to something called CapEx, capital expenditures. And Michael touched on this in his introduction. So capital expenditures are the infrastructure, the hard assets the utility builds to produce electricity and then deliver it to us all. So it's generation and it's T&D, transmission and delivery to us. And rates are set to recover the cost of that CapEx plus a return somewhere between 8 and 12%, depending on what state you're in and what utility you're talking about. So if utilities can build more CapEx, they earn more money, and if they build less CapEx, then they earn less money. You know, Warren Buffett once famously said, "I love the utility industry. It's the only thing where I can earn a profit from redecorating the boss's office." The arguments for net metering and distributed generation are that they reduce CapEx. So if you put generation, especially generation that generates during peak, so in Wisconsin when the sun is shining in the middle of the day and that those 2 weeks in August that are awful and everybody's blasting their air conditioner, that's peak. If you put generation at the fingertips of the system, you can reduce the generation that needs to be built, the size of the wires that need to deliver it, and the number of transformers that need to make sure that safety and reliability are preserved. So the main argument for rooftop solar goes right to the heart of how the utilities make their money. It reduces CapEx, whereas at the same time utilities want to increase CapEx. So addressing that tension between CapEx and distributed energy resources is kind of the key to finding a path forward. There's not a lot of utilities that will come into a general rate case and say, you know what, solar industry, great work. We need less money than we needed last time. In fact, MGE's reply brief in this case insisted that there is absolutely no savings that comes from solar. So I agree with Maria. We probably need an outside voice, a third party to come do that. I'd love to see that be Clean Power Research, Regulatory Assistance Project. I'd prefer it not to be the Brattle Group or Lighthouse or Navigant or whatever Itron is calling itself these days. And if you need to use GridWorks or Synapse, fine. But second, I think there is a real opportunity to kind of get beyond the controversy here and get past net metering. I love net metering. I think it's an excellent policy. It is the reason we have solar on rooftops today. That is the reason. It is that policy that did it. I think it's more than just a billing question at this point because of that. There's a huge history there and a huge amount of success there. So I think you got to get a little beyond just the mechanics of how billing is done. But my thought is like the way you move away from net metering, if you want to move from net metering, is you build a program that customers and installers choose instead of net metering. And you build a program that provides a similar or a comparable rate of return for the utility so the utility is agnostic to the fact that customers are choosing to use solar. And you know what? We kind of danced with this solution a little bit in the Alliant case, in the Wisconsin Power and Light case. That utility came forward with something that's called the System Asset Value Credit that they would earn a return on. And the value of that System Asset Value Credit was tied to avoided CapEx. It was the cost of the next generation that they would have had to have built. So they came and you had a utility saying, yes, this avoids CapEx, which is a wonderful and a progressive idea for utility to be putting forward, and Alliant deserves a lot of credit for doing that. But I agree with Corey, like that type of an approach, you can call it grid services, you can call it grid virtual power plants, et cetera, but that type of approach is how you get to the next generation of DERs. That's how Wisconsin starts to sew all of these systems together in a coordinated manner and operates as something that really can reduce peak, and then as that peak moves, it can shift to address that peak next. So that's the type of approach that we can follow. And there's examples. We're not the first people doing this. Hawaii incentivized people to program their solar and storage systems to export between 5 and 9 p.m., and they would get an extra incentive for doing it because they were trying to close a coal-fired power plant. And so solar is working to address that issue. And in Connecticut, in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, you have something called the Connected Solutions Program. And that pairs solar, storage, or a thermostat. It's a bring your own device. Anything you want to come and bring to like change how those things react, you get a payment for that. It's actually an upfront payment to participate in the program over the course of 5 years. These types of programs, this is where we're going with distributed energy resources. And if you want to get there, I think you got to find a place where both the utility can earn a return from the capex that's being avoided, and the solar industry finds something that say, you know what, this is better. I would rather do this than deal with net metering. I'm getting off my soapbox now. Yeah, I'll be done.
All right. So in thinking through what the next generation of distributed energy resources might face, this leads us to our next question, which tackles a specific aspect of rate design, something called time of use rates or time varying rates. Put simply, time varying rates are it's a schedule where the cost of electricity changes depending on the time of day of the week, and sometimes even the month of the year, to reflect more real-world pricing, and also in some ways to send a price signal to customers to use to apply their discretionary energy use to those times when it's less expensive, and to avoid running the dishwasher or charging your car at a high energy cost period. This has been slowly moving towards the implementation level in various places, but with the advances in metering technology, AMI metering, and specifically also often referred to as smart meters, we're seeing a decided pickup of utility interest. And most recently, we saw it with Xcel, and we're seeing it with Xcel in Minnesota. They are now proposing to the Utility Commission to impose as a default service, time of use rates, and with a pretty significant differential between the off-peak rate and the on-peak rate. So this is a somewhat more complicated billing mechanism, and I would like to ask the panelists how they think, if something like that were implemented in Wisconsin, what that would do to the deployment of behind-the-meter systems. So I will start with Maria here.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll be honest, I spent probably like an hour the other day staring off into space trying to conceptualize solar and the end of net metering and time of use and how all those factors fit together. And I create estimates and models for homeowners for a living, and it's a lot even for me to hold in my mind. So when you switch to time of use, you start to add a bunch of other factors into your calculations as a homeowner. So suddenly you have your different rate structures. Say you're a Alliant customer, you have low, regular, and high. And then at what times a day they switch from each different rate. And then over the course of the week, is it a weekday, a weekend, a holiday? And then every season, every 3 months, you switch to a different schedule and rate structure. And so that's just regular time of use. And then you add rooftop solar, and you add more complicating factors, which is what is your solar doing, and then the different buyback rates from the utility for low, regular, and high. So it went from a very simple system and easy for us to model as solar contractors and easy for homeowners to understand what their bill is doing and what their solar is doing, now has a multitude of different factors going into that calculation that can be quite confusing for anybody. And so I think that education, that transparency, that clarity can bridge that gap, but it is something that should be acknowledged. I have homeowners right now sending me emails, or a couple weeks ago, telling me they think that there's something wrong with their solar array. and I have to email them back and be like, well, there's 1 foot of snow on your solar array, and that's why it's not producing. So I think there's a gap between what we think maybe homeowners are able to conceptualize and really where people are at. A lot of people are kind of need a lot of education on how these systems work, even the ones that are choosing to go solar. So I think I'm going to make this point. I think this is the most important. If I had time of use and I had solar, your solar array is producing in the middle of the day, and the different billing structures that came out as alternatives to net metering from Alliant and MG&E were structured in such a way that they would have encouraged a lot of self-consumption. If I pushed solar back onto the grid, I would have been bought back at the utility from the utility at a lower rate than what I pay for it. So what do I want to do? I want to consume as much of the electricity that I produce as possible. And if you look at that, that would encourage using a lot of electricity in the middle of the day when the sun is shining. I'm going to charge my EV at 1 p.m. I'm going to crank my AC between noon and 2 p.m. to cool down my house for the rest of the day when my solar array's on. And then time of use is pushing customers to use as much electricity as possible in the low periods overnight. And so you kind of get these contradictory systems that can be confusing to homeowners. So I think the solution there is to value the exported solar energy from homeowners at such a rate that it makes sense for homeowners not to hoard it for themselves, not to try to up their self-consumption in the middle of the day as much as possible, or to not include battery systems that captures it all. If I had time of use and the electricity I was being pushed back onto the grid was being bought back by my utility at such a low rate, it would make sense for me to install a battery system, keep all of my electricity to myself, and use it in the evenings and overnight. And so if we want, as a community, solar power back onto the grid and shared to bring down those peaks on those 2 hot weeks in August, we need to incentivize homeowners by paying them enough for that solar electricity to value. Yeah.
Tim.
You want me to go next?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. I worship at the Church of Faruqi. I don't know if you know, Ahmed Faruqi is one of the thought leaders in this space. He has pushed time of use rates in a lot of different places. He's one of the key reasons California has default time of use rates, for example. Price signals are a great thing. They're good for peak reduction. They encourage electrification and electric vehicle use. If you can get a super low off-peak time, you can charge your vehicle while you're sleeping, right? That makes sense. Agree it can be beneficial for solar adoption if you put the TOU pricing period in the solar production window. On peak and peak would be great. And if you have really big differences between on peak and off peak, the differentials are big. You can encourage solar adoption as well, because you can shift when you're using the electricity that you're producing to either avoid high pricing periods or take advantage of exporting during high pricing periods. So all those are good things from a DER perspective. But you have to be really careful with default time of use rates. First, you need one heck of a marketing education and outreach campaign. You have to educate lots and lots of people about what's going to happen to their solar bills, because it can impact people that are the most vulnerable in your society if they're not paying attention to what's happening to their bills. So, for example, medical customers that need a ventilator running 24/7, they can't shift when that ventilator runs. They can't shift their load. Elderly people that do not do a good job responding to heat waves, that need air conditioning when those heat waves are happening, they can't really shift when they run their air conditioner. Low-income customers, studies have shown, are the ones that are usually hurt the worst by default TOU rates. So you need to have not only good marketing, education, and outreach, but you need to have some sort of an opt-out so that those vulnerable communities can not be affected by a shift to default TOU rates. And then lastly, from Maria's point, if you're creating an estimate for someone to go solar, you're moving from 12 data points to 8,760 data points. And so you need to have that data readily available. The best way to do that is to be able for a customer to go onto a utility's website, click once, download a spreadsheet for the last 12 months of their usage, 8760 that Maria and other intelligent people can then turn into a model for how a solar system is going to produce. So you have to have data if you're going to move to something that complex.
I'm on the hot seat, aren't I? It's my turn. I mean,
I'm interested in what you're going to say because I have no idea what direction you're going to go on.
I'm wild like that. Well, so again, I guess reminder, context. I'm by training an analyst, even though I run the shop on the regulatory side at Cub. At the end of the day, trained as a rate analyst, and so that's my home. That's where I live. All right. Organizationally, Cub, we've actually been talking with utilities about hey, can we have time of use be the default rate for new service? So not even just kicking everyone off of what they are right now, but if you move to Madison or whatever, or you move from one place to another and you start new service in a new location, then your new experience in that place is now on time of use. Because then when you start, you're kind of starting fresh, and it kind of makes sense, and it makes it so you're not having mass upheaval. But for us as an organization, we're already there. There are all the benefits we've talked about of time of use. Most of the studies that have been done in terms of rate studies across the country, as well as in Wisconsin, without any change to behavior, anywhere from 50 to 75% of residential customers would be better off under a time of use rate, right? There's a lot of, all the different rate levels and components and timing look really complicated, but at the end of the day, for most customers, they would probably see little to no change and potentially benefit from just a sort of standard time of use shift. All right, so organizationally, we're there, and we're absolutely in support of anyone that wants to move in that direction, but in a way, to Tim's point, that's measured and makes sense in terms of deployment, right? You can't just approve it in a rate proceeding, have it go into effect January 1st, and hope everyone understands what's gonna happen, all right? If you're gonna make that big a shift. To a certain extent, actually, we're thinking more in terms of how does residential time of use with demand charges fit in, right? Where does that make sense for residential customers? Both in your question, Michael, on this on time of use rate, and the last thing we talked about, there's an explicit or an implicit question about timing here. And the thing, I'm gonna say something probably a little potentially unpopular, right? Compared to you have your standard residential customer that's just consuming electricity, right? They're consuming that commodity of electricity. If you move to now being of self-supplying, of generating, of exporting to the grid, you are now a substantially more sophisticated customer from a technical perspective. And I don't think it's unreasonable to expect that if you make your relationship with the utility more complicated, that may come with complications in terms of there are more things you need to understand, because your relationship with the utility is now dramatically different. Okay, so I don't disagree with what you said in terms of especially if you marry time of use and net metering policy or whatever comes after net metering, that those two, especially layered on top of each other, gets really complicated. But I think to the point, Michael, you asked really about how this could facilitate or how this interacts with distributed energy resources. This is not a solar example, but you had sort of alluded to, or you mentioned charging vehicles. My wife and I, we own a Ford F-150 Lightning, right? It's a great truck, I love it. She's named Eleanor, she's bright red, she's in the lot across the street, okay? What most people don't know about that vehicle is if you install the Charge Station Pro that Ford will sell to you and hook it up with the max charging capability, and you plug that thing in, it is a 19 kilowatt charging load. That's your whole block. Right, and if we are on a time of use rate, right, and it provides me a very strong financial incentive to charge during off-peak periods. But an interesting thing happened 3 days ago. I went to Alliance Bill Comparison Tool. Well, they'll give you an estimate based off your last 12 months of usage of what your bill would probably be under their 3 residential offer rates, sort of standard flat rate, which most people are on, their 3-part time of use rate that has a seasonal component, and then their time of use with residential demand. And 6 months ago, before we bought the truck, the residential demand was slightly better off. Now I look at it, it's whoa, hang on, this would cost me more. and I looked at all the data about like how much you used by month, and it wasn't dramatically different, like usage patterns. And when I looked month by month on that comparison tool, it was just November, where the estimated November bill would have been higher than all of our bills in like the hottest months of the summer under any of the rate programs, because this one thing happened. On a Monday at 7 p.m., which is during the on-peak demand period for Alliant, I plugged Eleanor in, and for whatever reason, I think I needed it to charge. And so 17, 19 kilowatts of load slammed onto the system from our house. And if I had been on that rate, it would have shot our bills through the roof. So I tell that story by way of like, we're all for, the clean energy transition, we're all for beneficial electrification. And as we put more of these load sources on the grid, it's going to be increasingly more important that the rates that people are charged, like I said, going back to those 3 principles I mentioned at the beginning, it's going to be increasingly important that the rates people are billed reflect the cost to provide that service to customers. And I don't disagree that it's going to come with some growing pains, and we have to take that into consideration, but we really need to be looking at time of use like yesterday.
I haven't seen anybody walk into this room, even though we've shot past our closing time by 5 minutes. And I'm just wondering, I'm enjoying this conversation so much, and I wonder if we can just let it continue until, for another 10 minutes or so. Would you have any objections to that? So has a question come in from the audience? We have an app that collects questions from you, and Josh is volunteering to select the one he thinks that will be of greatest value to you.
In-person questions can also come into the microphone.
Oh.
So here's one, Michael, if you could repeat it through the microphone. With Emporia Energy providing energy monitoring products, and I assume other manufacturers as well, with the goal of aggregating a couple hundred residential customers with EV or other battery storage with time of use rate to become a utility selling energy at peak and recharging at low rate. That being an option, what's needed for our PSC to allow this, or for that to become a real option in Wisconsin?
So the question presumes that it is possible to aggregate these various loads into something that could interact with a utility.
That could be dispatchable.
And that could be dispatchable, which clearly can't happen now under current regulation, but could if we can figure out a way to chart a course for doing that. Did I rephrase that?
I think that's what they're getting at here.
Okay, so I'm wondering if any of you have any thoughts. I'll start with Tim.
There's a certain FERC order out there that Wisconsin has been reluctant to act upon. So we need that to happen first of all. And then the second question is, I'm not exactly familiar with the technology that it was, Josh. What was it called again?
It's a manufacturer called Emporia Energy, which they call a monitoring product, but there's got to be some control component.
Right. So Emporia Energy, and it would allow for like remote dispatch of a system or something like that. So yeah, there's a couple of pieces. One, you need a little bit more advancement in terms of the metering infrastructure that's currently deployed in Wisconsin right now. So there's not a lot of advanced metering infrastructure that is everywhere. I want to say Alliant is pretty far. You probably know these statistics. And then MG&E was like zero. Yeah, exactly. So there's definitely differences in terms of the metering infrastructure that could be used to help assist. Okay, how do you bill in that type of a scenario? And then you need distributed energy resource management systems to help, make all of that happen. So we need action on the FERC order, specifically from the Public Service Commission. And then I think we need some of the utilities to kind of catch up in terms of sophistication for metering infrastructure would be my answer.
And a quick follow on that, I assume adopting that FERC order would allow for a more subtle valuation of grid services and other things that would trigger behavior of those aggregated assets.
Right, yeah. I don't know how to repeat that, but yeah, I agree with you.
If I could on this, just building on what you just said, I think for those who are more familiar with it, or maybe less, in utility regulation, there's often sort of push-pull in terms of law versus policy and like what's kind of driving the bus in a situation. That FERC order, I'm assuming you're referring to 2222. Right now, in my mind, the biggest hurdle is that the regional market operator has been dragging its feet on actually putting in place a market tariff, a market rate or set of rules under which this aggregation would work, the market structure for that. And until that happens, then we really can't do anything because there's no value to be obtained by these operators for that service. So I suspect, this is me prognosticating a little bit, last I checked, there was a request by MISO to delay implementation of 2222 again. That was pending before FERC. Otherwise, it has to go into a place more sooner. In any event, whenever that happens, that will essentially drag that issue before this commission and our utilities because that will be there. And so until that happens, we're all sort of in a wait and see mode. But I suspect that once that regional market tariff is in place, then it'll be easier to say go to the regulator and to make that happen. But then the last piece is, I think to what Michael might have been alluding to earlier, is it's been a hot minute since I've checked the statutes for this one particular thing, but my recollection was there's something in statute that actually precludes aggregation of resources, so there may need to be a legislative fix too.
Yeah. So thank you for rescuing me on the details there. I really appreciate that. I was definitely spacing. But also, you don't need aggregation to get to grid services. You don't have to have a really sophisticated distributed energy resource manager to come in and have this power plant that's dispatchable, et cetera. We don't do that already. There's demand response, there's energy efficiency, and I'll point to that Hawaii idea again of it is just a customer agreeing to dispatch from this time to address that peak question. They can get paid for that agreement, and that is a one-person thing that is not operated by someone on high that is operating this virtual power plant. So there's lots of different ways to get at grid services where we don't need a legislative fix because who knows when that's going to happen in this state.
Yeah, so, and please rescue me if I depart too greatly from reality, but it is my understanding that Sunrun offers a package that involves solar and storage, and I believe it's in effect in Illinois, which is not covered, or at least the Chicago metropolitan area is the proverbial hole in the donut in MISO territory. It's subject to a different regional operator with the acronym PJM, but Sunrun has been doing brisk business installing solar systems that have a battery component and that is able to discharge electricity at certain prescribed times, or perhaps it's even on call. The signal comes from the grid operator, and that's another value stream for that system. So, and I don't think that would run afoul of aggregation. The aggregation that you were thinking of, well, it might. I don't know. Lawyers will have to.
What we're saying is true. Tim is right in that you could have utility programs that were direct to customer administered by the utility. That's historically just been the sort of purview of large customers up to this point, and sort of price responsive load, and dispatchable interruptibility and all that kind of fun stuff. But certainly you could develop a small customer program, but the technology probably isn't quite there in terms of deployed meters and that type of thing.
Well, I think it is there because this already exists. You know, it's the Connected Solutions program that I mentioned earlier in Massachusetts and other places. You might have some questions on verification and other types of things that I know Cub would be very interested in to make sure that customers actually doing what they said that they were going to be doing. Maybe there's a technology gap there, but I know for this is happening and we can bring it here and we can look forward to having this discussion in the parallel gen docket as we move forward on that metering.
That's true. Yes, we're not finished in Wisconsin dealing with net metering or the appropriate rate design for that. That issue was moved back to the parallel generation docket, and we're awaiting something like a scoping memo from the Public Service Commission to find out what the next steps would be for getting towards some kind of statewide approach to net metering design and deployment. And so, and with that, we're 15 minutes before the hour. I want to make sure you all get to lunch on time. And I want to thank our esteemed panelists for truly, there's a lot of intellectual nutrition there in the discussion. And I hope that, so thank you, Corey. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Tim, for this extremely enlightening discussion. And with that, we are adjourned.